Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss any update from Rouse IAS Study Circle. Join the only official Telegram channel of Rouse IAS Study Circle to get the relevant materials and important updates. Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, the what, why and how of the newspaper analysis from the Civil Service Examinations perspective. So today we are going to discuss the Hindu Delhi edition dated 31st May 2022. The topics to be discussed have been displayed on your screen and the timestamping of the same has been provided in the description box below. So let's begin our discussion with the first and very important topic, that is coal-based energy generation in India. This topic reads, India's changing goalposts over the coal. This topic has appeared on the text and the context page and is very important because of the very fact that General Studies Paper 3 mentions the syllabus in this very fashion. It reads socio-economic development as well as environment. Now the energy which is derived from the coal-based fossil fuel sources are important for economic development on one hand, and it also poses serious environmental concerns on the other. That is why this topic forms the intersection of two important topics, that is economic development as well as environmental issues. If you closely look the micro section of General Studies Paper 3, you will read two important sections, that is energy and environmental pollution. Further, from the current affairs point of view, this topic is also important because of the very recent context that our Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said that India's transition away from the coal as a fuel for power would be hampered by Russia-Ukraine war. Now here a logical question arises that how Russia-Ukraine war has hampered India's transition away from the coal. The answer to this is very simple. Now to meet the energy demands, if we are restricting our coal-based usage, then obviously we must look after some alternative source of energy. For example, natural gas. Now Russia is one of the major suppliers of natural gas in India. But because of the Russia-Ukraine war, the prices of natural gas has risen with a tremendous amount. And this rise in prices of the natural gas has hampered India's transition away from the coal. However, in today's session, we will not restrict our discussion to the narrow domains of the Russian-Ukraine war. Rather, in today's session, we are going to deal with all the major dimensions associated with the coal-based energy generation. We will look at what is the present status of coal usage in India. Then we will understand the benefits of moving away from the coal. That why it is important to move away from the coal towards some alternative sources, especially the renewable ones. In this line, we will also discuss that what are the associated issues and challenges in this very regard. And in the last, we will discuss that what can be a possible way ahead in order to overcome these challenges. So now let us begin our detailed discussion. First of all, let us look at what is the present status of coal usage in India. As far as the installed capacity of all the energy resources in India is concerned, more than 50% of the installed capacity is dominated by coal-based thermal power plants. This shows the sheer dominance of coal-based thermal plants in the energy basket of India. Further, IEA's Coal Report 2021 pointed out that demand of energy in India is going to rise by 4% every year. Now, this rise in demand is accompanied because of the factors like rise in urbanization, rise in industrialization, as well as the higher population base. Further, because India has a lot of economic and social ambitions, this also in turn requires a high energy base. And in this very line now comes the another important report, that is India Energy Outlook 2021. It said that since 2000, the energy usage in India has been doubled. Now this is not problematic. The problematic thing is that out of all the increased energy demand, 80% of that demand is met by coal. And that is why if IEA's report is saying that demand is going to increase, and because we have seen that the sheer dominance of coal in our energy basket, now most of this demand is going to be met by the coal-based thermal power plants. But then the question arises that if the energy demand is going to increase and we have abundant coal with ourselves, which we are utilizing to generate energy, then what is the challenge? What are the issues? Why we are talking to move away from the coal towards other renewable sources of energy? In this very line, now we will discuss the benefits of moving away from the coal. First and the foremost benefit is the environment perspective. We all know that climate change is happening across the globe. And this climate change is mainly because of the anthropogenic activities. For example, vehicle usage, industrialization, concretization, deforestation, etc. In this very line, the coal is one of the biggest contributor towards environmental pollution. The coal-based thermal plants generate huge amount of greenhouse gases, and these gases are responsible for the entrapment of the heat which is radiated back from the Earth's surface. And once this heat is entrapped by these greenhouse gases, the global temperature begins to rise, which is one of the biggest factor behind today's climate change. And because of this climate change, we are all aware about the increasing intensity as well as frequency of calamities and natural disasters like floods, cyclones, droughts, etc. Further, the coal-based thermal plants require a huge amount of mining, and this mining disturbs the rock-based ecosystems in those areas. Further, this mining is also responsible for large-scale deforestation as well as large-scale displacement of the sections of people living in those areas. And most vulnerable sections in those areas are the tribal groups. So the environmental perspective is one of the biggest reason that why we should move away from the coal-based energy generation. Now second comes the economics dimension. Now to meet the energy demands and to meet them especially from the coal, India is highly dependent on the countries like Australia. So if we move from coal towards other alternative sources of energy, for example the solar energy, then we can reduce our imports, which in turn can help strengthening our current account deficit. And India being the tropical country has ample amount of solar energy. So for solar energy, obviously we need not to depend on any other country. Now this is a natural freely available source. The second subpoint of this section is the capital intensive nature of the coal based thermal plants. Now if the government moves in line of the coal based thermal plants, then a huge amount of capital is invested and locked for a lot of time. On the other hand, if the government moves towards other alternative sources, for example, decentralized renewable energy sources, the capital involved in setting up of these plants are not very huge. And that is why the remaining capital can be utilized by the government in other social and economic sectors. And the last point in this subsection is the potential increase in the employment sources and reduction of inequality. Now, how is this related? Now, as we have talked that renewable energy can be generated from the decentralized sources. For example, you yourself can generate the solar energy by installing the PV cells on your roof. Now, if let's say farmers who are one of the most vulnerable section of India's population, now if we are giving them the power and resources to utilize their own roof for solar power generation, this in turn will reduce the inequality because now they are generating their own energy. They are not depending on the government and paying higher tariffs for the energy which they require. Further, there are also provisions that the energy generated from these decentralized sources can be traded also. That means that these can become the sources of income generation also, and hence will provide the sources of employment. Now next comes the social dimension, the social benefit of moving away from the coal. As we have discussed that the coal-based thermal power plants are one of the major sources of pollution which generate several gases, for example sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, etc. Further, they also lead to generation of fly ash. Now, these pollutants are highly responsible for the respiratory disease as well as cardiovascular diseases. So, if we move away from these plants, these pollution generating plants, obviously we are bound to have social benefits in terms of healthy population. And the last important reason for moving away from the coal is the international commitments in terms of environment which India has made. Now, India has given its INDCs, that is, intended nationally determined contributions at the Paris deal, whereby it has pledged to increase the concentration of the green sources of energy and to reduce the fossil based energies. Further, in the Glasgow summit, in this very line, India has specifically pledged to phase out the coal based energy generation. So, environmentally, economically, socially, as well as the moral commitments towards international pledges which India has made, all these reasons form a strong case to move away from the coal. But again, now the question rises that if we have so much of arguments in moving away from the coal and taking other alternative viable sources of energy, then why we are not shifting towards those sources? What are the reasons, what are the challenges that we are not able to jump from coal to other sources immediately? So in this line now we will discuss the associated issues as well as challenges. The first and the major issue is, as we have already discussed, that India is bound to face around 4% of rising energy demand per year till 2030 to 35. That means that we must require continuous supply of energy. And we know that presently if more than 50% of the installed capacity is coming from the coal-based thermal plants, then it is very difficult immediately to stop those plants and to jump to other sources of energy. Second, the coal-based energy generation is cheaper and the availability of coal is abundant in India. For example, the Gondwana sedimentary deposits in India is very abundant. So the coal is readily available. On the other hand, the renewable sources of energies are highly variable in nature. Now let us understand this important aspect. If you are generating the energy from, let's say, thermal plants based on the coal as a fuel, then you can generate the energy continuously given the fact that you have ample amount of coal reserves with yourselves. But on the other hand, let us take solar energy. Now, solar energy cannot be generated in nights. Solar energy will not be generated if the weather is very cloudy. Similarly, if you go by the wind energies are mostly suitable on the coastal areas because there we have diurnal reversal of winds in the form of sea breeze and land breeze. Then if you go by the geothermal energy, now these are very location specific because these can be generated only in those areas where you have accessible amount of geothermal sources beneath the ground. For example, in India, we do not have a very high potential of geothermal sources of energy. So these are the major issues or challenges which are hindering India's transition away from the coal. But these are challenges and challenges are meant to be overcome. And in this very line, now let us discuss that what can be the possible way ahead in order to overcome these challenges. The first is that there should be restriction in allowing the establishment of the new coal-based plants. Now this can also be done on the environmental clearance basis. For example, if you closely analyze this particular chart, there is a marked difference in the pre-2019 period and the post-2019 period. The environmental clearances given to the new coal-based thermal power plants, for example, in 2017 was very high, that is 9. But in 2020 it is 3 and in 2021 it has come down to just 1. This shows that government is wary about giving the environmental clearances to new coal-based thermal power plants. The second possible way ahead is increasing the efficiency of the existing plants. Now this is done in order to reduce the emissions without compromising the immediate demand. Let us understand this in practical manner. Now today let us say that we have X amount of demand and the coal-based thermal plants are able to meet this demand. But then they are generating, let's say, Y amount of greenhouse gases. Now, obviously, we cannot directly jump from the coal-based thermal plants to the renewable sources because obviously there will be a certain time which will be required towards this transition or shift. Until and unless we are able to completely transition towards those renewable energy sources, why not to increase the efficiency and technology of the existing coal based plants so that they are able to meet this demand X, but on the other hand, because of the improved technological innovation, the emissions which are coming out of these plants are reduced. So that is the role that you must invest in increasing the technological efficiency of the existing plants. Then comes incentivizing the renewables. This can be done in the form of government subsidies as well as reducing the power tariffs. Now let us look at these two graphs. This shows that the capital cost of the solar photovoltaic plants in India has reduced by 20% a year. This data is from the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, and this shows that when we compare two time periods, that is 2010 to 11 and 2016 to 17, we see that the capital cost has continuously reduced by 20% every year of the solar photovoltaic plants. Further, if we have to compare the power tariff from these solar plants, these power tariffs have also reduced by tremendous amount, that is 78% since 2010. So this shows that government has been continuously incentivizing the renewable sources of energy by giving various subsidies as well as reducing the power tariffs. Now comes the technological innovation. Now this point is closely related with increasing the efficiency of the existing plants which we have already discussed. In this very line, however, is important technological innovations in the form of new electric vehicles as well as induction based cooking. Now we must work towards reducing the consumption of the fossil fuels. This can be done by transitioning our mobility sources in the form of electric vehicles. We must do away with the petrol and diesel based vehicles, and electric vehicles must be promoted. Similarly, LPG based cooking can be transitioned towards induction based cooking. Similarly, there can be technological innovations in various electrical appliances also in order to reduce the energy consumption. Now, if you closely look at this particular graph, it says that it is expected that by 2025, the lithium ion battery cost would reduce by 70% from 2015 level. Now, if we are able to achieve this feat, this will be one of the major boosts in order to store the energy and utilize it whenever necessary. Similarly, technological innovations in other areas is taking silently. Energy efficiency of the domestic appliances have also improved. For example, in 1990s, a bulb used to consume 60 watt of energy, and in 2017 it has been reduced to just 7 watt of consumption. Similarly, the fan's consumption of energy has been reduced from 150 watt to just 28 watt. This shows that we must invest in technological innovations continuously in order to reduce the energy demand, which in turn will help us to reduce our dependence upon the fossil fuels. Now let us discuss this topic in brief once again. Initially, we discussed what is the present status of coal usage in India, and here we discussed that the major portion of the installed capacity is still dominated by the coal-based thermal power plants. In this very line, we also discussed that there are very high chances that in coming years, the energy demand of India will continuously increase, and most of this demand is going to be met by the coal-based sources. Then we discuss that what are the benefits of moving away from the coal-based thermal plants. And in this line we discuss that there are several environmental, economic, social as well as moral benefits if we move towards the renewable sources of energy and we do away with the fossil-based energy generation. However, in this line, then we discuss the associated existing issues and challenges. For example, we cannot immediately jump today from fossil based energy generation to the non fossil based energy generation. It will require a certain amount of time. Then we also discussed that the variable nature of the renewable sources of energy is also hampering the smooth transition. In this very line, in the end, we discuss the possible way ahead. The steps included in this was decreasing the permissions to establish new coal-based plants, increasing the efficiency of the existing thermal plants, incentivizing the renewable sources of energies, investing in technology, and reducing the consumption of the fossil-based fuels. Let's move towards our next topic. This topic is from the education sector, which is very important for India as well as very important for the UPSC's examination. As far as the General Studies Paper 2 is concerned, this topic directly falls under the subsection of social justice and microsection of issues related to the development and management of social sector services related to education. However, this article is related in the context of the poverty and linking it to the education. The topic reads, needed education data that engages the poor parent. Now we can understand that poverty is one of the major pain which still hinders and haunts our poor children to enter into the school ecosystem. Now on each and every stage, our poor children face challenge, right from taking the admission, paying the charges for getting the material, paying the fees, and paying for the school dresses. On every stage, they face certain challenge. And to overcome those challenges, many of those end up into entering into private schools. Now again we know that the private schools charge hefty fees, and that is how this vicious cycle keeps on rotating, hindering the future prospects of our poor children. In this very line in today's session, we are going to discuss multiple issues which are associated with our school education system, especially the public schools. We will also discuss the possible suggestions which can be taken in order to resolve these issues. So as we have discussed that first and the major issues are related to the finances of the education. In today's time, the education is not cheap. And because we know that around 27% of our population lives below the poverty line, it becomes very important for us to understand that how the lesser incomes hinder the future prospects of our poor children. Because of the meager incomes of their parents, there is a very low rate of admission towards school, and that is why low rates of enrollment. Further, even if once the parents try hard enough to allow their students to enter into the school educations, there are high chances that there will be higher dropout rates. Because then with time, parents feel that it is better to engage their children in some productive work. By productive work, they mean that they must employ their children into some labor work in order to improve the family income. And because of this very practice, there are high dropouts rates. In order to resolve these issues, what first we need to do is that we must strengthen the public school ecosystem in our country. As we all know that Right to Education Act enforces the fundamental rights of children to get free and compulsory education. And if we are able to strengthen our public school ecosystems, we can not only provide the free education to those, but on the same hand, also the quality education. This will reduce the engagement of the private schools as well as the coaching and tuition industry, which in turn will lead to reduction in the overall cost of education. And hence it will balance the financial issues. The second major challenge is of lack of guidance. Now, most of the sections of our children still live in the rural hinterlands, tribal areas, border areas, as well as inaccessible topographic terrains. In those areas, we do not have seamless connectivity, we do not have adequate number of schools, and therefore we face the challenge of lack of guidance. And this challenge is not restricted to children alone. Parents also feel such challenge, and in many areas parents are not aware about what to do with their children, how to proceed with their formal education. And because of all this, the grassroots education ecosystem of India lags behind. In order to resolve this particular issue, we can leverage the technology. Because with the help of technology, for example, using of smartphones, internet connectivity, distant learning, we can improve the accessibility as well as affordability of quality education. Further, we can also provide the quality teachers as well as materials at very low cost towards the most inaccessible areas. Third issue is related to the lack of infrastructure facility. Still, our public schools do not have well equipped classrooms, computers, laboratories, and playgrounds. For this, what we can do is that we can adopt an integrated ecosystem model. By this, I mean that yes, there can be sometimes logical reasons that why our public schools in rural areas are not well equipped with all these facilities. There might be reasons of funds crunch, there might be lack of spaces available to construct the playgrounds. So, in this scenario, we can integrate the education ecosystem, that is, we can tie up with certain private schools. For example, if we have one government school in this area and because of certain reasons, this government school does not have the laboratory. At some distance, there is some private school which is having the lab facility. So why not we can integrate and coordinate with these institutions and we can send our children from these government schools to the private schools for only those certain lab experiences. This is what an integrating the ecosystem means. The next issue is related to the gender inequality. We all know that still there are certain areas, still we are into such level of socio-economic development that in certain areas, in certain families, girls are not allowed to go to schools. If they are allowed to go to schools, they are not allowed to move out their hometown for higher education or for better jobs. Now, to address this particular challenge, we must also recognize that are there any sound reasons for this issue? Yes, there are some. In many areas, we are not able to provide adequate security measures in order to protect the honor and dignity of our girls. That is why their parents do not feel safe enough to send their daughters to schools. And for that, we must strengthen our security measures. Further, we must also strengthen the sanitation and hygiene in our schools. And then we need to increase the awareness and sensitization programs of the parents and convince them and persuade them so that they can send their daughters, and all the responsibility of these things must be on the local administration. Next issue comes the poor learning outcomes. We all are aware about the annual survey of education report which is published by the NGO known as Pratham. According to this report, the class 5 students are not able to solve class 2 questions based on numerical ability. Further, during COVID times, when we are all aware that physical schools were shut down and the education was solely dependent on the digital means, this report pointed out that 25% of the children didn't have any access to the mobile phones. And in this very particular period, the learning support at home has also decreased. So, in order to address this particular issue, we must do away with the rote learning system. In order to improve the learning outcomes, we must engage in quality improvement of our teachers. We must focus on conceptual learning, and the focus of evaluation should be classroom participation by student, projects, communication, and leadership skills and extracurricular activities. We must not separate the curricular and extracurricular activities. We must have an integrated system whereby there is no discrimination against certain subjects, whereby curricular and extracurricular activities are integrated. So that is how we can improve our learning outcomes. Next comes the high burden on teachers. Now, this is also one of the major issues because of which the teachers are not able to do their job diligently and effectively. Our administration works in such a manner that even NIPA report pointed out that just around 20% of the teachers spend their time while teaching, and rest 80% of the time was consumed by non-teaching administrative work. Now this is primarily because the school administration do not appoint the required number of supporting staff for their administrative work. In order to prevent their expenses, they deploy the teachers for their administrative work. So that is why it is said that teachers must be freed of these works and quality improvement sessions of these teachers must be done. And the last but not the least issue is of accountability. There is a lack of accountability because the school management committees are largely dysfunctional in schools, especially in the rural areas. Parents, especially the poor parents, are not aware about their rights, and that is how the vicious cycle goes on. For this, we must focus on awareness generation program for the parents. We must make them aware about their rights as well as duties, and we must also focus towards increased parent-teacher meetings and associations in order to build a cooperative approach to strengthen our school education ecosystem. So these are the various steps which can be taken in order to strengthen our school education ecosystem in our country. This topic has appeared at page number 14 in the economy section. The topic reads, Government is set to advance bank privatization. Now we all are aware about this recent issue that government is planning to privatize some of its banks. And this topic has led to a lot of hue and cry in the market when several bankers as well as banking employees came out on roads in order to conduct the protest against this particular decision. From the UPSC Civil Service Examinations perspective, this topic falls under the General Studies Paper 3 section in the micro section of Indian economy and issues relating to planning and mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. In today's session, we are going to discuss the major issues of bank privatization, that why government is planning towards bank privatization, are there certain issues involved, and what can be a possible way ahead in this situation. First of all, before coming to the merits of banking privatization, let us understand the backdrop, the background in which the government has decided to privatize these banks. Presently, India have two types of banks. First is the public sector banks and other is the private sector banks. But the issue is that the public sector banks are facing a lot of challenges. For example, out of the total NPAs which stand for non-performing assets. Now, out of the total NPAs in our country, the major share, that is around 70% of the total NPAs, is shared by the public sector banks. Now, there are a lot of reasons behind it, but in today's discussion, we are not going into those decisions. First of all, we know that public sector banks are having a lot of non-performing assets. If the bank's assets are not performing, it means that they are not able to create credit. There is a low credit creation in our country, because of which there is very low return on investment for the banks. And if there is no return on investment for the banks are not able to further multiply the money. And because of this, banks are facing huge amount of losses. Further, if the public sector banks are facing losses, then the government has to recapitalize those banks. In this recapitalization, government transfers a huge amount of money to the tune of thousands of crore into the banks. But because again the public sector banks are facing a lot of NPAs, even this money also turns out to be an NPA, which in turn means that there is a huge loss of taxpayers' money. Further, the evidences also suggest that as compared to the NPBs, which stand for the new private banks, the public sector banks are working at a very lower efficiency. And all these factors ultimately lead to a slowdown in the Indian economy. In this backdrop, as one of the measures of the banking reforms, government has come up with the idea of privatizing the banks. Now let us understand that what are the various merits in privatizing the existing public sector banks. So the first point which argue in favor of privatizing the public sector banks is the underlying philosophy of the competitive market. The philosophy says that in those areas where competitive markets have already emerged, for example, in the banking sector, the competitive markets have emerged. We have a lot of public sector banks, then we have a lot of private sector banks. So, in those areas where competitive markets have emerged, the government should discontinue its engagement in producing the goods and services. Government can act as a role of facilitator, but it should not be an active player for producing the goods and services in those areas. The second important point is related to the overall efficiency. Now there are ample amount of evidences that in the areas where private sector has engaged and competition has emerged, the efficiency of the private ecosystem has surpassed the government ecosystem. When it comes to the profit making, when it comes to the revenue generation and wealth creation, private sector surpasses the government. That is why, to improve the overall efficiency of the banking sector, the proponents say that government must go ahead with privatizing the public sector banks. The third point is in relation to the creation of large sized banks. Now, you all are aware about the systemically important banks, and in those lists, only one is the public sector bank, that is SBI, and the other two are the private sector banks. If we compare our large sized banks with the global banks, India has only one bank in the global top 100 banks. Further, the largest bank of India, that is State Bank of India, is positioned at 55th at the global level. In India, there is almost a virtual monopoly of the public sector banks, and this is reducing the competition and is breeding the inefficiency. All these factors hurt the overall growth of the banking sector, and that is why the proponents again say that government must go ahead with privatizing. Further, the previous experiences of the strategic disinvestment in certain PSUs, for example BPCL, HPCL, etc., have also given us the positive results. So we hope that even in the banking sector, those results can be replicated. Now, next argument is very interesting. It is always said that the public sector banks are mainly to achieve the social objectives of the country, and the private sector banks are mainly to achieve the private objectives, that is, the profit making. And that is why, because our India needs social objectives also, the public sector banks have huge relevance. But there are certain case studies, for example, Jan Dhan Yojana. In the Jan Dhan Yojana, the private sector banks were also leveraged in order to promote the social objective of financial inclusion. That is why the experts say that it is not important to have public sector banks only for the social causes. Even the private sector banks, mutual fund institutions, as well as other NBFCs can be utilized to achieve the social objectives. And the last argument is that the privatizing the public sector banks will also reduce the financial burden on the government. Because as we have already discussed, that government is under the duty to recapitalize the public sector banks in order to comply with the Basel III norms. And if the privatization goes ahead, the government will be doing away with the need for undertaking this recapitalization, and those saved money can further be used under some other productive areas. So these are all the arguments which favor the privatization of the existing public sector banks. Now comes the arguments against the privatization of the public sector banks. First and the foremost argument is that privatizing any institution is not the panacea to all problems. Why are we not focusing towards improving the governance framework of the public sector bank themselves? Why aren't we reforming the board, the structure of the public sector banks, the administration and management parts of the public sector banks? If we can reform them, then it is very sure that PSBs can also play an important role in the wealth creation as well as the profit making. Second is that the private banks have very high banking costs. For example, in public sector banks, you can open your account at zero balance, but in private sector banks, there should be a minimum amount to open your bank accounts. And given the point that in India there is a huge inequality and below poverty line population, the high banking costs of the private banks may hinder the India's aim of financial inclusion. The third argument is that even the private sector banks are not free from corruption and frauds. And the last point is that the employees of the public sector banks are not happy with the privatization. There have been a number of protests in the past against the privatization of PSBs, and that is why to convince and to persuade these employees it is a very difficult task. That is why now comes that what can be a way ahead. First, the experts believe that the government can come up with a strategy to privatize some of the medium sized public sector banks and reduce its ownership to below 51%. This means that there will be three types of banks. First will be those banks which are completely government. Second, there will be those banks which will be completely private. And third, there will be those banks whereby government is having the minority shares. The second important is that government should focus on bringing about the holistic reforms on the lines of various committees like Narsimhan Committee 1991, Rajan Committee 2007, and most recent one PJ Nayak Committee of 2014. Now PJ Nayak Committee had given elaborate recommendations about reforming the overall structure of the banking ecosystem. So these reforms can be taken up by the government in order to increase the efficiency of our banking ecosystem. This is the last topic for today's session. The topic reads After Effects of Anti-Corruption Laws. Though this topic is mainly from the perspective of the study which was conducted in USA and is also related to the corruption law which was passed in United States of America. But I have taken this topic in order to take this as a case study. You people can use this case study as a reference in some of your GS answers or essays because the research paper, which was titled as Bribe Switching, which was published in America, is very relevant for almost all the countries. Because this research paper points out to a very important phenomena. It strikes an important belief which says strict laws are better. This research paper has been based on the findings of the implementation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that is FCPA of United States. Now let us think that what is the general perception of the public. Most of us believe that there should be strict laws and implementation of those strict laws can bring about a real change in a society. And that is what was perceived in USA also. And because of this very belief, USA passed this Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. According to the general perception, it is also believed that decrease in the corruption by the public servants will improve the economy and will be reflected in improving the GDP. However, this research paper has challenged both these perceptions. This research paper not has just challenged, it has also provided ample number of evidences in order to contradict these two claims. Let us understand that why this research paper says that strict implementation of laws lead to development of rather stronger illegal markets. The strict laws are not able to cut down the incidence of bribery, rather, the bribe takers take to the illegal routes and strengthen the black market. Let us understand this with a practical example. Let's say this is a public servant and he have two options in front of him. First option is related to the infrastructure project which is purely a legal project, and the second option is related to the liquor tender which we assume is illegal. Now, this public servant, until and unless the corruption related laws were weak enough, was taking the bribe in these projects. But when the laws become strong and their implementation was very harsh, this public servant could not take the bribe from these infrastructure projects. Further, because the public servants are deprived of the bribe taking in these legal projects, these projects got delayed. And because of the delaying of these projects, there was a huge governmental void in this sector, that is the infrastructure sector. Now, the remaining option with this public servant to cope up with the loss of bribery which was coming to him earlier from this project, he will take the bribes from the illegal market. Now, because illegal markets are not under the regulation, thereby the strong anti corruption laws are very difficult to implement in these areas, and therefore the bribe taking from these areas become very easy. But what does it ultimately lead to? It ultimately leads to the flourishing of the black market economy. So, this is what this research paper has come out with. This research paper says that there was no real decrease in the level of corruption among the public officials as bribe taking activities shifted to the illegal market due to stricter implementation of such laws. Now, as we have discussed, that a public servant has two options. One is from the legal system, other is from the illegal sector. So the public servant comes out with the cost benefit analysis. The receiving of the bribes by the public servant, either to the legal market or the illegal market, depends on the relative cost of receiving the bribes. When the cost of extracting the bribes in the legal market increases, now because the laws are very strict in the legal market, that means the punitive measures against the public servants will also be very harsh. That is why there is a higher risk, and the public servant might have to pay enough cost for taking these bribes. That is why the public officials resort to the illegal market for obtaining the bribes. Further, the dependency in the getting approval for the projects due to lack of the payment of bribe make officials to focus their efforts on approving those projects which are illegal in nature so that they can extract maximum money out of the bribe from those illegal sectors. Due to strict implementation of anti-corruption laws, public officials then resort to the illegal market to maximize the bribery revenue. And as we have discussed, this practice has significantly increased the size of black economies in the United States. So this research paper comes out with very important findings. First, that it shatters the general perception that stricter laws and their implementation is the only solution to tackle the corruption, especially the bribery part. Second, it also shatters the general perception that the corruption activities are only restricted to India or developing economies. The most developed economy of the world, the most transparent and democratic country, that is USA, is also facing a huge challenge related to corruption and bribery. So that is why I have taken this small topic in order to provide you with an important case study which you can use in your answers and your essays wisely. Now is the time for the question of the day. The question from yesterday's DNS dated 30th May 2022 was in relation to the Global Security Initiative. The question said that Global Security Initiative has been proposed by. There were four options given, and the correct option to this particular question is option D, that is China. China has proposed the Global Security Initiative. The question of the day from today's DNS dated 31st May 2022 is in relation to the ASER report. You have to find out the correct statements out of the given two statements. The statement 1 says the annual status of education report is led by the National Council of Educational Research and Training, that is NCRT. The statement 2 says in addition to the schooling status of the children, household information is also collected every year. Option A, 1 only. Option B, 2 only. Option C, both 1 and 2. Option D, neither 1 nor 2. So that's all for today. All the very best. Study hard.